A reading from 2 Corinthians 11 and 12. Whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled, and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I will boast in the things that show my weakness. Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, it's good to be with you this morning. I have to confess, I was up pretty late last night finishing a paper. Some of you might not know, I'm also a graduate student myself. I'm the Associate Dean of Student Care here at Wheaton, but I'm also doing my PhD, and I had a paper due last night, and then when I looked at the calendar a couple weeks ago, and I thought, okay, now, Tuesday night, I have a paper due. Wednesday night, I'm speaking in chapel. That probably wasn't the best timing, but I know some of the pain that you feel about your papers and exams. So I'm just wondering, how many of you have a paper or an exam that's due this week? Raise your hand. And professors, how many of you are giving a paper or an exam? Let's do this, or making a paper due or an exam this week. All right, well, some of you have that. So I just have a question. Have any of you ever gotten a paper back or a test back in a classroom, and all of your peers have gotten the same paper back, and someone comes up to you and says, "So, what did you get on your test?" And you know that the only reason they're asking you what you got is because they got a good grade, and they want you to ask them what they got. Have you experienced that before? Well, I had an experience like that before, but I was on the other side of things, the side that you don't want to be on. My husband and I were recently married, and we were watching television, and this television show came on that said you can test your IQ by watching this show and answering these questions. So I said, "Hey, I think we should do this. This would be a good idea." He said, "Okay." But then I started thinking, well, we're newly married, and what's going to happen when I score higher than he does? He's going to feel really insecure. You know, it's a new marriage, but whatever, we'll give it a shot. So we started the IQ test, and I was doing great. And then kind of toward the end of the first round of questions before the first commercial break, they started getting a lot harder. I started guessing. I wasn't sure exactly what I was answering, if it was correct or not. So we went to the commercial break, and I said to Jeff, I said, "Wow, those last couple were really hard, weren't they?" And he said, "Which last couple were hard?" No, there wasn't. Those were easy. And he felt very confident that he knew all the answers. So then we tallied up our scores at the end, and I scored a little above average. I was hoping for a little higher, but then he showed me his score, and he was at the genius level. He was actually a little above that. So I thought, wow, I married a genius. I had no idea. So thankfully, he did not rub that in my face, and he still hasn't really over 15 years of marriage, which I'm grateful for. But that whole idea of what are you doing? Are you accomplishing as much as I am? That's really, scholars agree that that's one of the things that was going on in Corinth at the time of this letter. Paul was writing to the Corinthians partly in a response to their criticisms. and they were questioning things about his apostleship. Why do you have the authority to be an apostle? That was one of the questions that he was responding to. So the people were saying things like, we have this heritage, we're ancestors of Abraham, we're Jewish, we have these intellectual abilities, these spiritual experiences, and Paul, what do you have to offer? So a lot of the letter is Paul talking about that. And some of the verses we read this morning, Paul does list the things that the same accomplishments that they had, that they listed. But then Paul goes on to start listing other things after that. And I won't list the whole thing again, but we see here in chapter 11 where Paul starts talking about being beaten and being stoned and shipwrecked and being in danger from the Gentiles and toil and hardship, sleepless nights, being hungry and thirsty without food. He says things like, besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all of the churches. He says before that, right away in chapter 1, he says, we do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of the affliction we have experienced in Asia, for we were utterly, unbearably crushed, that we despaired life itself. When you read those verses, you start to hear some of the intense pain and anxiety that Paul was going through. So when I think of that, I think he talked about this intense anxiety. Was he having panic attacks, the way that maybe we understand anxiety today? When he talks about utterly despairing life itself, if I hear somebody saying things like that to me, I'm going to ask them some tough questions. Are you suicidal? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? These are some of the things that Paul was saying in this letter. So as he's talking about why he has the authority to do what he's doing, he starts talking about all these painful and difficult things that really show his weaknesses. So just after he's listed all of these things point by point, answering the Corinthians, saying, yeah, I have that too. I've done that too. I'm Jewish as well. I have these same accomplishments. He lists all of his weaknesses. And it's as if he turns the argument upside down and he says, this is what I am going to boast in. I am actually going to boast about all these really difficult things that I've been through. I'm not going to boast about all the things that you're boasting in, all of the accomplishments, all of the things that I could point to and say how great I am. So I think the question that raises is, why did Paul say that? Why was he saying that he wanted to boast in his weaknesses? And I think we see that answer in chapter 12 that Christy read for us earlier. I'll read it again for us. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So this is his reason. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. That's one of my favorite verses in this whole book. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. That was his answer. That was how he answered the question of, who are you to do what you're doing? I will boast about my weaknesses. So I think about the question and how that relates to my life. And if somebody said to me, why do you have the authority to do what you're doing here at Wheaton? Who are you to do this work and this job? And I think about my education or my experience, and those are certainly things that help me in my work. But I'm reminded of my own story. And that's what I'm going to share a little bit with you here this morning. When I was 10 years old, my parents got divorced. And from that time, really up until early adulthood, till I was about 18 and I went to college, I had a lot of pain in my life that I really was not dealing with. And I started developing coping mechanisms and things that were trying to really get me through that difficult time. And by the time I got to college, I really was kind of a mess inside, but didn't really know it. And just things kind of started falling apart in my life. But things really came to a head the summer after my freshman year. I was a camp counselor, and I was working with students, and I don't know if any of you have been camp counselors before, but I developed these really close relationships with the fellow counselors. We had this great Christian community. So we started getting close to each other in a way probably that I hadn't before with that kind of group of Christians. So I decided, I really want to start talking about some of this stuff that I'm going through and some of these things in my life. So I decided one night with a very close friend to really confide in him and say, these are the things that are going on in my life. And I thought, after I do that, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, I'm going to feel free, it's going to be great. So I did that, I went to bed, and I woke up, and I can honestly say I've never experienced anything like this, and I really hope I never do again. But it was as if someone took a switch in my heart and just turned off my emotions and turned off my soul. And I had no idea why. I couldn't really connect the conversation that I had just had with this friend with what was going on because it didn't seem like it connected. And I was just at a loss. I didn't really know what to do. I went to the director of the camp because I was struggling to the point of not really being able to be a counselor to the students. Told her what was going on. She was very wise. She said, why don't you take some time off of being a counselor for the next batch of students that come, and you can work in the kitchen. And just take some time to reflect and really press into God. So I did that, and I met a friend, Aaron. I'll call him Aaron. And he was really life-giving to me. He started talking about his own struggles with depression. He had actually been hospitalized a couple times for mental health reasons, and he talked about what it was like for him. But what he didn't do is he didn't start giving me advice. He didn't start trying to fix me. He didn't start telling me things that I needed to do to get myself better. There were so many evenings that we would sit together, and sometimes he would just play music, and I would just sit there and just listen. And we didn't sometimes say much, and it had gotten to the point where I really had a hard time sometimes even talking to people and carrying on conversations. And I can honestly say that meeting Aaron that summer and being able to put words onto what was going on in my life was so powerful and helpful for me at that time. And I realized that I was severely depressed. That was one of the realizations that I came to from that summer. So then I thought, well, maybe if I go back to school, everything will just kind of click back into place. I'll get back into my routine and I'll be fine. And that did not happen. I got back to school and things actually got a little bit worse. I wasn't really able to do very well academically. I started missing some classes. I started going to professors and just saying, I'm sorry I didn't get this assignment done. I just can't focus right now. And I think probably one of the lowest times of that period, I remember sitting in my dorm room at the time, looking out the window and thinking, if things get really bad, I could always end my life. And that's an option that I have. Now, I never had a plan for that, but those thoughts entered my mind and I started ruminating on that. And that became, in a very unhealthy and difficult way, that became almost a source of strength for me, which I knew was not supposed to be that way. So at that time, I knew that I really needed help. And if someone had said to me, Allison, someday, these are the things you're going to boast about. This is the time you're going to look to your life of saying, this is why I'm called to ministry. This is why I have authority to do what I do. This is why God would call me to something beyond myself. I would have thought that that person was crazy who told me that. I would have had no idea what they were talking about. But now, when I look back over the years of healing that happened in my life, I can see the reality of these verses that Paul is talking about. I got involved with a Christian therapist that was really life-changing for me. I can't imagine who I would be today without her and her ministry in my life. There were friends like Aaron that I had at school, dear, dear friends that will always be so special to me, who I can just remember tangibly them just sitting with me and just listening and saying, it's okay to not be all right now. But probably the most healing time for me was getting involved in a church that really believed in the power of healing prayer. And I probably received hours and hours of prayer over the years. And it was learning about Jesus' suffering. Not only the suffering of Jesus on the cross in that event of the cross, but the suffering that Jesus was doing with me tangibly in that time in my life. And when I think about now, the reason that I am able to do what I do in my ministry, I can look at these verses and say, that is why I am able to do what I do. It was really that point in my life. Because when I was completely stripped of myself, and those were the things that I had looked to in my life were no longer there, that was when the power of Christ was made real and tangible in my life. See, up until that point, up until that time in my life, I had always been performing. I was a piano performance major in college. I was an athlete. So the victory of, I played volleyball. The victory of the game was really what I was focused on, getting my performance just right. So I got a lot of accolades for that. And I was, up until that point, had been able to present an Allison who was competent, and I felt somewhat talented. I felt significant. But at that time in my life, the Allison I had to present was weak and broken and felt defeated. And probably the hardest time, or the hardest part of that time in my life, was feeling the shame of not being okay. And the fear that if people actually knew who I was, that I would not be loved and that I was unlovable. I think about having an iPhone that's been stripped of all of the apps, and you turn it on and the screen is blank. And I felt like a blank screen. And I thought, how could I ever be useful? And what could I ever do? But that time of healing, the power of Christ working in me, helped me to understand that it wasn't about me being useful. It wasn't about my performance. It wasn't about me mustering up enough in my life to be worthy. It was about the power of Christ working in and through me. And if those things had not been stripped away, if those apps had not been taken out, if the screen had not been clear, then Christ's power would not have had the opportunity to manifest in my life and change me and minister. So now when I'm sitting with students in my job, or a friend or family members, and they're talking to me about painful times that they're going through, I can look at them and say, I understand possibly some of what you're going through, and I can know that the power of Christ is going to work in their life because I experienced it myself. If I didn't have that, I can honestly say I would be so much less effective in my life and in my ministry than what I'm doing now. So I can honestly point to those things. The same way that Paul is saying, it's because of my weaknesses that I can do what I do. I can say the same thing. It's because of that time in my life, and really daily the times in my life when I still need the power of Christ, and I still see my weaknesses day after day after day, that I can say that is why I can do what I do. So I want to ask us this morning, what is it that you look to? What is your list? What do you boast in? What are the things that you are most proud of in your life? Is it your undergrad GPA, your GRE score got you in here, the idea of finally having your degree and graduating, maybe publishing a paper, a book, presenting at a conference? What are those things that you are most proud of and that you most boast in your life? Isn't it hard not to look to those things? I think about when I came to Wheaton to interview for my job, if I had sat down in my first interview with Paul Chelson, and he said, so tell me, why do you think that you're qualified to do this job? And I said, well, let's see. Let me start at the beginning. I had a speech problem. I couldn't say my R's very well when I was about 4, and I had to go through speech therapy, and that was really hard. And then my best friend decided not to be my best friend anymore when I was 5. The problems got worse, and then my parents got divorced, and then when I got to, if I had just started listing all those things, kind of like Paul did, I wonder what he would have said. and I wonder if I would have gotten this job. But I think that is the hardest tension, isn't it? That we want to have these accomplishments to get us to where we want to go. Everything in our society, and even the church, tells us that. Be good, perform more, do. But I don't know how Paul got this, but somehow he had this deep awareness and understanding that it was not about his accomplishments, that it truly was about Christ's power in his life. And my prayer for us this morning is that somehow by the power of the Holy Spirit, we can understand that as well. And we can understand that it is not about ourselves. It's about the power of Christ. So I ask you again, what is your list? What do you boast in? Most of us have resumes. And I wonder about what a resume of weaknesses would look like. That's really what Paul listed, isn't it? That was his resume of weaknesses. And if we had that resume and we lifted it up and we said, this right here is the power of Christ in me. That is why I can do what I do. So I want to encourage us this morning that as we all leave from here and we prepare to be psychologists and missionaries, we're sons and daughters and sisters and brothers and spouses and parents and professors and administrators, when we leave from here and we do all of these things, that this Christian life and the ministry that we do is not about being perfect. It's about the power of Christ working in our lives. Amen.